Hello, and welcome to this virtual Getty Villa. And today's lecture, I'm Tim Potts, the Maria Hammer Tuttle and Robert Tuttle Director of the J. Paul Getty Museum. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to us today. We have a wonderful lecture in store for you on early Mesopotamia. And the background to the lecture is, of course, the exhibition that we currently have at the Getty Villa. There is a backstory to it. The exhibition was scheduled to open in March of 2020, and just 2 days or 3 days before the exhibition was due to open, we all had to close the museum because of COVID. So it was the opening never took place. But through the generosity and collaboration of the Louvre, where the works of art belong, we were able to extend their stay here in California in the hope that we would be able to open when the COVID situation improved, as it eventually did. And therefore, we were able to open a couple of months ago, and the exhibition is now up and running and has been seen by many, many people. And I hope many of you on the screen today will be able to attend. The subject of the exhibition is, of course, ancient Mesopotamia, which has a very special place in the sort of story of human history as the first fully, as it were, rounded civilization that we know of, the earliest writing, the origin of the very first cities with monumental architecture, huge city walls, temples, administrative buildings, a very structured society, many specializations in technology, agriculture, engineering, and such like. Also very sophisticated in its science, mathematics, and so on. So many extraordinary achievements of a culture that really begins in the full-blown form that we're talking about around the middle of the 4th millennium BC, let's say 3400 BC, and survives and flourishes even for 3,500 years until the last cuneiform text that we know of, cuneiform being the writing system of ancient Mesopotamia. The last dated tablet is around 70 AD. So that period of the culture and the civilization is an extraordinarily long and rich and important one. The collection that you see in the exhibition has come almost entirely from the Musée du Louvre in Paris. And through their extraordinary generosity, we have many of the greatest masterpieces of ancient Mesopotamian culture and art on display here at the Getty Villa. So this is a really extraordinary act of generosity on their part. And it's a wonderful opportunity for both the local community here in Los Angeles, Southern California, and the United States generally, to see these great masterpieces and to understand something of the importance of this culture, both for, in a sense, its intrinsic interest, but also for the influence it had on other cultures, including, of course, that of the classical world, Greece and Rome. In the wake of Alexander the Great's conquest, there was this very interesting and important coming together of these two cultures. And the Greeks, in fact, learned a lot of their astronomy, mathematics, and so on from the Babylonians. As well as the exhibition, there is, of course, a catalog to the exhibition, which I hope many of you will want to have. And that's been co-edited by Ariane Thomas and myself, and the exhibition likewise has been co-curated by us, but of course, is based on the collection that Ariane Thomas herself oversees at the Louvre. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce her to you and just give you a short version of her many achievements. She is the head of department, the senior curator of Oriental Antiquities, or Near Eastern art, as we would call it, the Near East representing, as it were, the modern Middle East. So she's the head of the Near Eastern collection at the Musée du Louvre and is a specialist herself in ancient Mesopotamia. She took her doctorate at the Sorbonne in Paris, and has been responsible since then for many research projects, exhibitions, both in France and elsewhere, and many other excavations also in the Near East, in Mesopotamia and elsewhere. And she's also directs the Louvre's current project of restoration at the museum in Mosul in northern Iraq, Mosul being the city right next to the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh, which you'll hear about in the exhibition. So we're delighted to have her with us today, and she will be providing, I'm sure, an extraordinary overview in her lecture of some of the material in the exhibition and the themes that are highlighted in the exhibition. And I do encourage you to stay on after the lecture, because we will be having a question and answer session. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome Ariane Thomas to present her lecture on ancient Mesopotamia.
Hello, I'm Ariane Thomas, and I speak to you from the Louvre, the Khorsabad Court, and it is a very special occasion. I never did it, to be honest. A lecture that I was supposed to give in LA last March in 2020, by mid-March, when we were supposed also to open the exhibition so-called Mesopotamia Civilization Begins at the Getty Villa, and unfortunately the official opening date being March 18th, we couldn't open. Thus we tried to find another way to talk to you about this exhibition, and hopefully we will thus discover a bit more about ancient Mesopotamia through this show that is currently at the Getty Villa. So as a start, I presented an image that is among the other treasures of the Ancient Near East department in the Louvre. Of course, we do have an extraordinary collection, and many masterpieces are now in Los Angeles, but we also do have a treasure of archives, and especially photographic archives, among which we do have some of the oldest archaeological photographs, because everything started with the excavations of Khorsabad in the 1840s, and as early as in the 1850s, the second responsible of the excavations of Khorsabad, a French consul called Victor Place, brought with him someone who knew at that time to make photos while it was just invented. And so I have this image that is an image from the past showing the Tigris and the way on the Kelek, those very first archaeologists could bring the pieces that are behind me from Mosul and Khorsabad, the region of Nineveh in the north of Iraq, to Paris here in the Louvre. We will now look at this map that was prepared by our teams. Mesopotamia being this land between the two rivers after its Greek name, which just means that. Mesopotamia is more or less modern Iraq. So that's what you see on the map, and this is, let's say, the geographical definition of the topic of the exhibition, but then we also do have a chronological trail that is following, let's say, 3,000 years of history, from the very beginning of what we officially call history, which means we do have written sources, and that happened in the late 4th millennium BC when writing was invented. The first writing known today is cuneiform writing, found in southern Mesopotamia, and more or less at the same time also in Iran and in Egypt, with different autonomous systems. And from the, let's say, late 4th, early 3rd millennium to the 1st millennium BC, you have those 3,000 years of history that we do present on a thematical way inside the Getty Villa. Mesopotamia knew lots of ruptures and changes, political changes, populations, migrations, many changes. but that at the same time it also, especially in the official courts, considered that there was a continuity in this history. So tablets were copied years after years and century after century, as well as monuments were built and rebuilt century after century. The first space you could enter when hopefully you will visit it is devoted to the cities, and it is called First Cities, with a quote from Gilgamesh, a very famous legendary king of Uruk in the south of Mesopotamia, telling about his great work, especially to build walls for his city of Uruk. And in this space, we do start presenting how it did start, because what must be highlighted is that the first cities we do know up to date were built and were discovered in Mesopotamia. That's why we do consider that it was a urban world, and that the very first cities are Uruk and those other cities. You see here some of the remains of those very first cities that appeared in the 4th millennium in South Mesopotamia, and especially here from Uruk, with some of the decorations of the walls, and you had those cones with different colors that you could insert in the walls made out of clay, and thus, as you can see from the image on the top left, you could have a mosaic effect on large part of the walls, and that was quite magnificent. I also show you here something that you can see at the villa, which is a vase very typical from the Uruk period, this period in which cities appeared, which shows that it was accompanied by the, let's say, specialization of the people living in the city, and that probably is the best definition of a city, which means that more or less it could also be even smaller than a village, but in a city we do have people specialized. You do have an administration, you do have craftsmen, you do have priests, and of course kings, and workers and things. People who are not only working in agriculture, for example, as it was the case, and it is still the case in many villages. So more or less, city is a trade center, more or less, where people do specialize. Cities are obviously a human creation, and we had to recall here also that in the Mesopotamian belief, humans were created by gods, and they were created by gods to serve them. So that is this slide that I present, where you can see a very famous tablet telling about the creation of man by the gods, when they, well, more or less think that they are tired to work, and it's so hard that they want to find another solution, and the solution will be to create human beings so that they work for the gods, and they serve the daily meals, and they do everything that might be pleasant to the gods. Still, the first humanity being quite, let's say, well, making too much sound, gods will decide to destroy it, so that silent will be again a peaceful one. But Enki, the god who really created the human being, will decide to save the wisest of the men, and it will be more or less like then in the Bible, the story of the flood, because gods will send to the humanity a terrible flood to destroy everything with water, and Enki, the god, will just warn before this very wise man who will become immortal and who will save humanity and also various sort of animals with him. in this urban world, there is an infinity of gods. And there's also a hierarchy of gods with specialties, all of them having their residence in the cities, in the temples built and rebuilt by the men. And here I show you again the map because I think this is an important idea to recall that for Mesopotamians there is an idea that urban world is the civilized world, and it goes with the title of the exhibition, while you do have chaos and you have to fight this chaos. That's more or less what you can, let's say, symbolically see on this little piece that is in the exhibition, and where you see a fight between a bull and a lion. I also show you a very famous stela brought from Paris to Malibu, where you can see a human, a king serving the gods, to recall that they were adoring the gods through those offerings. And among those offerings, they could be done through precious vessels, including this exceptional vase in silver dedicated by Enmetena to the god Ningirsu for its daily meal. Inside the temple, we can find sometimes, when we are lucky, that sort of very precious vessel, but more often it has completely disappeared. And to be honest, Mesopotamian archaeology is quite hard, because very often even the temple itself disappeared because it was made out of clay. And clay architecture being extremely fragile, it had to be rebuilt, and if not, it just melts. And that's what you can see here. This is a picture I made myself in Ur, and you can see how the clay architecture is easily destroyed and very difficult to recognize. Knowing this, Mesopotamian kings used to deposit some foundations deposits made out of stone, made out of metal, that was, they knew that this would last more than clay. And this is what you can see here with a foundation deposit from Lagash in the end of the 3rd millennium that is presented at the Getty, with this foundation figurine made out of metal along with the cuneiform tablet in stone. Clay architecture at the time of its splendor could be very monumental and spectacular, and that's what the Bible still recalls, telling, for instance, that in Nineveh you would need 3 days to cross it, and this might be better evoked through the 3D reconstruction, such as the one I show here, which is a 3D reconstruction we do at the Louvre for Khorsabad. So this can give you an idea of how it did look when it did exist at the time of Sargon II in the late 8th century before Christ. Of course, we couldn't bring Khorsabad to Malibu, so we did bring only a very, tiny fragment compared to Zeus, but very monumental. It is the head of a lamassu, of a bull with a human head and wings. Also, so those guards that were protecting the entrances of the city and the main gates in the palace of Sargon II and many Assyrian cities the same way. So we couldn't bring it, it's too monumental, but you can, in Malibu, see at least a head of such a guard, and to be honest, it was already quite an adventure to bring it, because it is extremely heavy, even only the head. Another monumental piece that we owe to the generosity of the Metropolitan Museum in New York is a glazed brick panel from Babylon that not only gives you another idea of the monumentality of the ancient Mesopotamian architecture, but also recalls that it was very colorful and really splendid. So this panel shows a lion of the goddess Ishtar, and it did belong to this beautiful city. If we do follow Herodotus, it was the most beautiful city in the ancient world, some that nothing could be compared to. This panel was among 120 lions that would follow you on the main road in Babylon, the processional way that did cross the very famous Gate of Ishtar that is partly reconstructed in Berlin. Here I just show you the room that is devoted to this theme, ancient city, before focusing on another theme that is ancient writing. Here I show you one of the oldest tablets, the oldest cuneiform tablet, dating back to the end of the 4th millennium. And this ancestor of writing is telling you a bit about exchanges between Uruk and the Gulf. I can just tell you that in the exhibition, along with many explanations on the cuneiform script and its evolution, you could also experiment what was central for the ancient Mesopotamian writing, meaning it was orally transmitted. Many of the texts, Gilgamesh epic and others, were told orally, and that's why we did insert an experiment made with Cambridge where you can listen to somebody reading, telling out loud an extract of the Epic of Gilgamesh, so that it can give you an idea how it did sound to listen to this ancient language.
Gilgamesh ana shashuma izakara ana utana pishtim ruki. Anatana kuma utana pishti. Minatuka ulshana kiyati ama ata. Uata ulshanata kiyatima ata. Gomor kalibi ana epesh tukunti. Ahinadat elutzerika. Ata ki tazizma in a puhur ili balata teshu.
We also had a very important loan from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and it is here, the Caillou Michaud, just to recall that 170 years ago, when it all started, we did know nothing about ancient Mesopotamia, and we were totally unable to understand the cuneiform script. So, for instance, this caillou that is more or less, let's say, a gift, an exemption of taxes from a king to a member of his family, and we had the most funny translations because nobody could answer it. And this is thanks to the first excavations that quite quickly in the 19th century we finally deciphered the cuneiform script and first the Assyrian language. Let's say also Akkadian. Along with the question of writing, we do evoke also the economy of ancient Mesopotamia that was notably based on agriculture and husbandry, as you can see on those pieces, but also on exchanges. Mesopotamia is more or less at the center of what we call the Middle East, and so it was really crossed by exchanges and influences through the land, through the rivers, of course, and through the sea, especially the Gulf. Writing is also evoked through the diversity of the cuneiform text. So we can find, and here you see some examples, maps, we can find model, we can find exercises, we can find contracts, laws, we have administrative documents, many, and we also do have, for instance here, mathematical prism that could be used even today for exercising students. Let's also recall the importance of astrology and astronomy, as it was the basis for our modern knowledge. And I will recall with this image that ancient Mesopotamians did recognize many planets and did organize, through their accurate observation over centuries, they did organize time, just as we still use it. So the calendar, and here you do have a calendar with the 12 months, the fact that 1 hour has 60 minutes, all of this comes from ancient Mesopotamian. Also, they did have the oldest libraries we know, and all of this knowledge was partly done, conserved in those very famous libraries. Among the most famous one, there is the Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian king library that was located in Nineveh. And here in Malibu, you can see a tablet that belonged to this very famous library of Ashurbanipal in the 6th century. And as before, I show you also the room devoted to writing. This room is quickly followed by a corridor devoted to cylinder seals. And this is a very great space to discover this other treasure of ancient Mesopotamian materials with many stones, many colors, and wonderful sculptures in miniature. So you do have those precious objects that were used as a signature to seal a letter, a vase, a door, anything. And we can show you here a vase that was sealed with clay and the imprint of a seal on it, but it was also worn for protection. The last room is devoted to the kings. I will just recall that the very first kings, and this is the title of this space, the first kings are obviously known in Mesopotamia, since writing gives us the very first name of those historic kings. I will present you here an image that may sound familiar to you, since this was also the main image selected for the show. This image that you may have seen in the streets in LA shows you Gudea, a very famous prince, a Neo-Sumerian prince in the 22nd century before Christ. And here you can see him really between humans and gods, because he's the king, he's a human being, and he's also, holding the vase with the water emerging from it. And inside the water you can also see fishes. This is a sign that water brings fertility, and so he's clearly, between human and gods, the first mandatory of gods, and bringing fertility thanks to the support of the gods to his kingdom. So he's really the representative for both sides. He's also a clear image of the, king praying, king devoting, the devout king to the gods. Another stela is showing you another main function that was devoted to the kings, and any Mesopotamian kings, one reigning over a small kingdom or one in the first millennium over a very large empire, they would share those same functions. And apart from being the first praying one to the god, he should also be a warrior king. And here you have a very, very thin and wonderfully carved stela of victory from an Akkadian king. I also show you an image showing a king making this, and he's in fact having a basket of bricks on his head. This is another function. This is the builder king, the builder and rebuilder king. So he has his basket of bricks ready to build or rebuild what's necessary temples, palaces, walls, or anything else that is necessary to the prosperity of the kingdom. The other image is showing you a piece that couldn't travel to LA. This is the very famous Codex of Hammurabi, telling you about the function of the king as a king of justice. And we were happy to bring part of the Code of Hammurabi to LA with fragments from another stela, as we know that Hammurabi did spread his code over the kingdom, and so we do have those fragments from another stela, less conserved, but this way it could travel to LA. But before leaving the kings, I must also remember that this power, this royal power, was transferred within a dynasty, and especially from father to son, even though it was, of course, very often more complicated. Let's not forget also the other people around the king, and notably the women. And here I wanted also to highlight that we brought to you a very beautiful statue showing a priestess that can give you also an idea of how an Hedwana would look like, as we also wanted to tell you about this very famous lady that was a daughter of a king, an Akkadian king, a priestess in a temple, in a main temple, and the very first known author in history. She wrote many poems, many beautiful ones that you see on the screen. Not only daughter of kings, I also highlighted the wife, mother, grandmother of kings, with this very famous metallic piece showing Nakiya along with her son Assaradon. And Nakiya, for many, was a figure that might have inspired the legendary queen Semiramis, as she was among the very rare, known in history, women for having a political power. Among the very last image, this is the peristyle, and we used it as a timeline. And along this timeline, those 3,000 years of history, we exhibited a few, let's say, main and magnificent royal heads, telling you about some of the main kings in Mesopotamian history, from the Sumerian period in the 3rd millennium to the 1st millennium. And indeed, we do finish with a king that was not so much Mesopotamian, as it is the head of Alexander the Great, and that is of course fitting better with the other Greco-Roman heads that are presenting along the peristyle at the Getty Villa. But it also tells you that that was a very important episode in Mesopotamian history, since in the 4th century BC, the conquest of Alexander the Great, who admired a lot Mesopotamia and did die in Babylon, willing to make a capital of it, was also, let's say, the beginning of the end, and the beginning of the end of this very old civilization, as it was more and more Hellenized, more and more diverse. And even though we kept memory of it up today, and then we rediscovered this history through the archaeology, that was the end and the start of, let's say, a dynamic of forgetting Mesopotamia before rediscovering it 2,000 years later. So I hope this could give you the will to go to the Getty Villa as soon as possible, and as soon as possible too, you're of course very welcome in the Louvre.
Ariane, welcome back. Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture, which covered a lot of territory. And we do have, therefore, quite a few questions. The first one is asking, when we say the oldest civilization, the first writing and so on, does that mean first in the Western world, or are we talking globally? Would you like to start off on that?
Well, I think we can answer both. This is probably the thing that I think, and perhaps we share that, is quite fascinating in our field, which is that it is always up to date, and we don't know what we will know tomorrow. So, of course, and so far, this is among the oldest achievements that we do know, and this is exactly why we want, and it is essential to continue to work over there in the field and to protect those fields that are extremely threatened currently, to make sure that we didn't skip something essential that we can find on the field. So far, those are among the oldest, and perhaps we will discover something again. In the late 19th century, when some French did excavate at Tello, they had kind of a vertigo discovering that the history they thought was so much older than they previously thought they would find. And they found millennia that they wouldn't have guessed, thanks to their archaeological work.
Yeah. And that leads into another question, which maybe I can begin to answer, which is about the Mesopotamian writing versus Egyptian. And is it true that Mesopotamian is earlier? But it seems at this point, again, we don't know what we will discover, as Ariane has said, next year or a decade from now. But the earliest texts from Mesopotamia date to about 3400 BC, level 4A at Uruk. And they were refuse. They were being reused and buried. So they are actually older than that, but we don't know how much older. The earliest texts in Egypt that seem to be genuine writing, of course, earlier there are pot marks and various other things that are leading towards writing, but not quite writing. And the earliest that seems to be generally accepted is in a burial called Tomb Uj at Abydos, one of the Dynasty 0 kings. So just before the first dynasty. And that seems to be perhaps a little bit later, but only by a century or two. So in this context of thousands of years, a century or two is not very much. And we have to keep an open mind about what might be found in Egypt that might push it back earlier. One last thing I'd say, though, that this is a period at the end, in the late 4th millennium, where you do find in Egypt a number of motifs and styles of architecture that seem to come from Mesopotamia and even Elam, slightly to the east of Mesopotamia. So there does seem to be some contact and influence from Mesopotamia to Egypt around this same time. Whether writing was in some way part of that influence, we don't know. In fact, the Egyptologists are pretty clear that no, it wasn't influenced from Mesopotamia. It was an indigenous process of creation, and the writing system itself is certainly very different. So that's where we are today. Who knows where we will be tomorrow? Can I move on, though? Unless, Ariane, do you want to add anything to that before we?
No, you made it very clear, perhaps, as you mentioned, Elam, and this will bring our audience further east. But indeed, you also do know about the Proto-Elamite writings that we don't understand so well now. But so it seems that perhaps due to these exchanges, it makes the various cultures more innovative, and probably in this context, they do invent autonomous system in terms of linguistic to write, which is completely new. And apparently so far, this first appeared in Uruk, which clearly, as you said, had roads of trade towards the east and the west.
Yeah, exactly. There were a cluster of questions about Babylon, the city of Babylon. We're going to jump around a bit, but I'm trying to answer a few questions and put them together. One was about how large it was, both in terms of population and area. I seem to remember that the walls of Babylon are some 6 or 8 miles long. Herodotus talks about how long they are and how wide they are, and you can have 2 chariots on the walls of Babylon. It was the most spectacular and largest city of its day. And again, but I'm reaching into old memory here, I think the speculation on population, and we don't have, of course, real numbers because they didn't do censuses, or if they did do a census, they didn't record them. But so all we have to go on are the areas of housing and so on, and we have to make estimates for how many people would have lived in these sorts of houses. I think the estimates have been well over 100,000, even close to 200,000 people, something in that range. So it was the most major city of its day, of course, far eclipsed later by Rome and maybe even Alexandria. But in the 6th century BC, which is when Babylon was at its height, it was something like that. Do you want to, again, would you like to?
Oh.
Okay.
Perfect.
Well, let me put the next question to you. You mentioned the Lamassu as representing a god, the god Lamassu. The question was, what gods does it represent? So I think there's a little confusion here about whether Lamassu is a god, a genie, etc. But you could perhaps clarify that.
So let's say it's a divine creature that is good. So you need its protection, and we see it since the 3rd millennium as a protective creature that has the strength of a bull, the face of a human being, and also the powers of a bird with the wings. So we do see it in the iconography for 3 millennia, and it is only in the 1st millennium that it becomes so monumental, as you did see on the course about the monumental Lamassu, so these winged, bull-headed creatures that did protect the main passage in Khorsabad and in many other Assyrian cities. So I don't know if that does answer, but the Pantheon is quite complex and very populated, if we can say so, in ancient Mesopotamia, with a hierarchy, with main gods, and also then gods who have a little less power, and also those creatures, among which those Lamassu. I don't know if that is enough clear, and if you want to add something, Tim.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered it well. I'll ask you another question, combining another couple of questions. One is about women writers, and of course there's Enheduanna, which you mentioned. And another question was about if there was this oral tradition of delivering orally, why was there the need to write them down also on clay?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to answer, or?
Why don't you start?
Okay, I can start. So why? Actually, this is the main question we do ask, of course, because we have this treasures of a million tablets, a million cuneiform text, which is really huge compared to the other ancient text in antiquity. But still, what do we have, and what was exactly noted? If I can take an example, we do have so many contracts that are extremely important to know better about this aspect of life that is still very important in our modern life. Still, we know that many contracts, if not much of them, that we have are in the cases that were complicated. The other, let's say, wedding contracts, for instance, were not written. So apparently, so that is really a question that we have to take into account, that what was written was not necessarily always what did count. I mean, many other things that were working well might have not been written, or might have been written later for memory. So I don't know if it is not maybe too complex, but so to answer, there is a parallel life, let's say, between the oral culture and the written culture, especially for anything that has to do with daily life. It is probably a little more simpler when you go into the literature and religious texts, because of course here you have a tradition of writing in temples, and so again, to answer, I think that some things were written for very practical reasons, other because it was in the traditions of the temple to copy the text, and then for the rest, we also do wonder what has not been written. That was the first part of the question. If you want to add something, Tim.
I think I will leave it because we have so many other questions.
Okay.
Maybe
do you want to answer about women?
Well, just to reinforce what you said, that as it happens, the earliest author that we know of in any culture so far is a woman. She was the daughter of the king of Akkad named Sargon, and he appointed her as the priestess of the moon god at the city of Ur. So this is the 24th century BC, and she is credited with having written a number of hymns and other literary compositions, which are mostly about the gods and the things that you would write about as a priestess in Ur. And the tradition treated her as a very eminent and perhaps even semi-divine character in the tradition of Mesopotamian literature. And so she is this extraordinary figure. And we have a number of these compositions, some of them in the exhibition, not from the 24th century BC when she lived, but as Ariane was saying, these things were copied and copied and copied over the centuries. So we mostly have examples from the early second millennium BC, but these things are preserved, and her name is ascribed to their creation. Staying with writing, we've got a couple of questions about how it was deciphered and whether Assyrians and Babylonians would have been able to understand and read Egyptian writing, and would Egyptians have been able to read Assyrian and Babylonian. The average Egyptian and Babylonian would not have read Egyptian or vice versa. However, we do know the kings, particularly in the late Bronze Age, let's say from 1500 BC to 1000 BC, a period of much international trade, contact, conquests and other things. So, but a lot of diplomatic, shall we say, activity. And there was a constant flow of letters between the kings and the princes of Babylonia, with the specifically with the Egyptians, but also with peoples in Syria, in modern Turkey, right down the Levant, in Lebanon and current Israel. So there were certainly scribes trained bilingually to read Assyrian Babylonian. They are just dialects of the same language, and Egyptian, but they would have had to be trained specially in these other languages. And we do have some cases where we know they were even trilingual or multilingual. So this was a profession. The scribe was something, they were essential to the operations of all of these cultures, and their training was a very rigorous and very basically a lifetime of learning. The other part of the question was about the decipherment of how did we learn to read cuneiform writing. I'll give the very short answer, which it was based on an inscription that the Persians in the late 6th century, the King Darius, created at a site called Behistun in Western Iran, and a bit like Champollion deciphering the Egyptian hieroglyphs because he had a Greek version, the Persians also did this text in 3 languages: in Elamite, the native cuneiform language of Elam, in Babylonian, and in Old Persian. And because Old Persian is a known, as it were, language, it could be the first to be deciphered. Then it was recognized that Babylonian was a Semitic language, connections with names from Herodotus and other things. It was a very high intellectual achievement. But in the middle of the 19th century, over a period of a couple of decades, some really brilliant people, Rawlinson, Hincks, Opbert, and others, managed to work out that the Babylonian script was a Semitic language, therefore the basic grammar, the basic vocabulary could be worked out, and then it went from there. And we now have a very good understanding, in fact, of Assyrian and Babylonian and through the periods that they were being used. Ariane, would you like to?
No. You did sum up this perfectly. I think we can just have a brief thought for those who brought back copies, stamps, and drawings after these inscriptions, and also originals, because this is because of this amount that then those wonderful scholars who except perhaps Rawlinson didn't go so much in the field, did decipher by the mid-19th century the Akkadian language, so-called Assyrian at that time, because they had Assyrian inscriptions.
And there was a day on which they declared the decipherment, because 3 people were given the same inscription in a blind copy, and they all had to submit their translations to the Royal Academy. And they read the translations, and they were sufficiently similar. I mean, more than similar, very close to each other. So they declared that if 3 people independently can come to the same
French and British agreed,
and Irish,
so it was done.
It was UNESCO type operation.
Indeed.
We were asked about the large figures in the second gallery, and I'll just mention that they are in those very dark stones. One is an Akkadian figure, King Manishtusu, one of the sons of Sargon, who I mentioned earlier, so as a sibling of Enheduanna. One was a figure of Gudea seated, and we haven't talked enough about Gudea. Maybe that should be next. And the other is an unknown ruler, maybe a few centuries later of the early 2nd millennium. But these hard, dark stones, which take a very high polish, were particularly used by the Akkadians, and then in the regimes in the centuries following, they also adopted this material and very widely. A question about Gudea was his hat or his bald head, and what is the nature of his cap? Is it a royal or not? Perhaps you would like to talk about that.
So it is royal, actually, and he kind of launches something, because after him, the kings that will go after him, not only in his kingdom of Lagash, in Mesopotamia for centuries, will keep this habit of having such a hat with a large border. The only difference is indeed that only at the time of Gudea you do have this cap with this curly motif that, according to some, might have evoked some fur, but this we are not sure of. It's only a hypothesis.
Another question is what is the current state with excavation in Iraq, and also with your project in Mosul?
So actually we were lucky enough, and we had this honor to receive the director of the Antiquities of Iraq a few days ago, very recently here in Paris. So I will just quote him, allow me to quote him. So Iraq is, as you know, a country that is suffering many crises, sanitary as everywhere in the world, but also economical, political, and of course with many consequences in terms of security and safety still. And this is really, I think, something we must think as something positive, very bringing hope. It's a country with such a vertiginous history, full of archaeological remains, and still teams, Iraqi teams and foreigner teams do work in Iraq. They succeed to go there, and the Iraqi government, and especially, of course, the Directorate of Antiquity, is extremely supportive of that, and we must be extremely, I think, thank them for their support, while it is very complicated for them to do it. So I will also quote something else that is the main issue they face, which is the traffic of antiquities and the looting on sites that we know, sites which we don't know yet, where nobody did work so far. And that is even harder because we don't know what is on this site and what might be found on those sites. And also, of course, you know that the looting of museums for artifacts from we know. So, of course, this is just to make everybody sensitive to this, because it's extremely difficult, and only all together, of course, we can help this. So then, to answer to the question about Mosul, the Louvre, together with the Smithsonian Institution, the World Monuments Fund, and supported by ALIF, is involved, highly involved, along with our Iraqi colleagues, in the rehabilitation of the Mosul Museum, which suffered, as probably some of you did see on screen, suffered from a very terrible destruction and looting at the same time. Some videos were online by ISIS showing the intentional destruction of some of the masterpieces of the museum. So here, we try to work with our Iraqi colleagues to help them, because of course, if it had happened to the Louvre, we hope our colleagues would come to help us the same way. It is a complete disaster, with bombing, destroying the objects, the flood, the fire. They had everything almost. So we did all of what was the most urgent, and now we work to restore the collections and hopefully rehabilitate the whole building and museum until its complete reopening.
Thank you. And I'll maybe give quick answers to a couple of questions about. One is the function of the ziggurats. These are the step towers, these massive step towers, which start in the Sumerian period but continue on much later. Herodotus famously describes the one in Babylon, and talks about there being a shrine at the top. There certainly are these steps, these stairways that lead to the top, but none of the ziggurats are well enough preserved to really know what was on the top, but presumably something, since there are these stairways leading to it. They were, as it were, aspects of the religious architecture, often next to temples, and they certainly, being high on a temple, meant you were closer to the gods. So it's something putting you in connection with that other world. They're not burial. They're not like pyramids in the Americas and so on, which have burials in them. They are purely, as it were, built structures that would be a platform for ceremony or something else, which would be, on the top. The use of seals. These were essentially signatures. There's usually an inscription which names the person and their title. And then there's the iconography that goes with it, which changes throughout the centuries, and therefore is an important, as it were, element of the art history of ancient Mesopotamia. So they were rolled onto the tablets, the clay tablets, which were in cuneiform, as it were, like a modern signature that we would use in signing a contract. But they were also decorative and, is a way, protective. They were worn. Often they have a pin through the middle of them, which could be attached to a garment. And they would, the iconography would, in some cases, be apotropaic. It would protect you from evil forces and beings that could do you harm. I think we've got time for one only, or at the very most, two questions. One was about the role of animals in ancient Mesopotamia. Of course, they were an important part of animal husbandry, cows, sheep, and so on. It's a very hot, desolate landscape, particularly the south. So it's not a place where you can have horses and certain other animals. But of course, they were the use as a source of food, and pastoral activity was a large part of the economy, and much represented particularly in the early periods, the Uruk period of the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BC. Perhaps the last one, Ariane, for you, about the Assyrian Empire. And why did it come to dominate the ancient Near East? Were the Mesopotamian empires more violent than other empires at the time?
So, actually, to know why the Assyrian Empire did start, we can say that we have a story of a little land, that is the Assyrian land, having no exit, no sea, threatened by the mountains and the plains and the steppe. So more or less they came from a defensive strategy to an offensive strategy, enlarging their land to threaten instead of getting threatened. So while they were closed on their not so little, but still little land of Ashur, by the end of the second millennium, we see that there's a new energy and a new strategy that is very military, and so they do attack to enlarge their territory, which also brings them wealth and many ways to have more power. So they did extend to the various orientations, the north, the east, the west. They were extremely proud to go even to Egypt, and this is something that we can see in the text and in images. So to make it brief, I think, yes, the Assyrians then were in this dynamic of an empire, and they wanted to get bigger, which in a way probably explains some of the crises they had to face. Some they did solve them, and in the end they were defeated by a combination of Babylonians at the south that previously they submitted, and Medians from the east. So I hope this does answer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, we are at 11:01, so I'm afraid I think we need to draw things to a close. I want to thank Ariane particularly for such a wonderful lecture, and also for answering so many of your questions. So there is another month with the exhibition open through the middle of August. So if you haven't been to see it already, please do. And hopefully today's event has provided some background and a framework in which you will gain even more, hopefully, from seeing the objects at the villa. So again, thank you very much.
Get rid of the prejudices, because in a way, the violence of Assyrian is kind of a prejudice that we got from the Bible and the Greek houses. So probably thanks to the Getty, because we also shall thank the Getty for welcoming this exhibition. That is indeed the first occasion to show this civilization in such a large way in California. And you can go through what you may have heard about Mesopotamia to have a direct relation to those objects.
Indeed. Well said. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ariane. Thank you to all of you. And we look forward to seeing you, hopefully, at the museum very soon. Goodbye.